My name's Savelle Locke and I am a member of the Labour History Project Committee who helped organise this event tonight. I work here at the Herenga Waka in the History Department, and my thanks go out to our colleagues in the School of Government who sponsored us and gave us this beautiful room for us to hui in. Now, this biennial lecture marks the life and work of the amazing Rona Bailey. She was a communist and an educator, a dancer, a labour historian who took part in trade union, anti-war, anti-apartheid and Project Waitangi movements. So what we do is we invite speakers to come and talk about their experiences of one of the issues that Rona fought so hard for. And it seemed absolutely fitting this year when the chance to gain pay equity was so abruptly stolen from us to focus on the history of the Public Service Association, Rona's union, when she first started campaigning for equal pay back in the 1940s. Right? So tonight's lecture is called The State and the Union, 114 Years of the PSA. It gives me a huge pleasure to introduce your speakers tonight. First up we have Mark Darby, who's a writer and historian, has worked for public sector organisations such as the Waitangi Tribunal, Manati Taonga. His books include a biography of former PSA General Secretary Dan Long, and he's the former chair and current life member of the Labour History Project. Next speaker up is Mary Ellen O'Connor, who's been a teacher, a political candidate, a writer, and most significantly for tonight's talk is the author of an oral history of the PSA. And for those of you with sharp eyes, you'll see that there are copies out there on one of the tables, which you're welcome to take away with you. But if you're feeling generous, a donation to Union Aid would be very much appreciated. Mary Ellen also has a deep interest in public services and Aotearoa New Zealand history, and she is also a long-time member of the Labour History Project. You'll notice a theme running through there. Fleur Fitzsimons has worked for the PSA for nearly 20 years as a legal officer, communications advisor, organiser. To reward her for amazing efforts, she's currently the National Secretary of the Union. Fleur also was a Wellington City Councillor between 2017 and 2022. Now, when I first met Fleur, it was back in 2014, she came and spoke to my class about that amazing 2013 Employment Court ruling that cases for equal pay for work of equal value could be made under the 1972 Equal Pay Act. So on that amazing moment, in this moment, I brought up Mark will speak first. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes. Mary Ellen will return for the final word, and then we'll open for questions. Mark.
Thanks, Isabel, and thank you all for getting here, given the meteorological circumstances. I live in Lyle Bay, and I tell you, I'm well aware of the tribulations we had to face in the last 24 hours or so. It's a privilege to me to contribute to this talk on Rona Bailey. Rona was a friend of mine. I had, the greatest admiration for her. I'm pleased that her daughter is here with us today. And I'll be talking about the first 60-odd years of the PSA, a period well before my time as a member of it. And the others will talk about the more recent period, as Isabel says. So up there we have the first issue of the PSA Journal. It looks pretty boring, and in fact the members at the time said that it was pretty boring to read, but it got better, believe me, as things went along. That issue dates from 1914, and the PSA itself was established in 1913. There had been several short-lived earlier attempts to form a representative body for public servants. They didn't last long. They were vehemently opposed by the government and the press and others who thought it was wrong in principle that public servants should have a body to represent them in negotiations with the state, believe it or not. But by 1912, the Public Service Act was passed to, let's see, to better manage a fast-growing state with a lot more departments, a lot more people. In particular, it was designed to sort out the thorny issue of political interference with the public service. Prior to that, it was not at all unknown for certain politicians to parachute their mates into plum jobs over the heads of longer serving, better qualified career public servants. People recognised that that was a very undesirable situation. So instead, a public service commissioner, the post of public service commissioner, supposedly independent of all political control, was established to deal with matters of career advancement, that sort of thing, promotion and so on. And the right for public servants finally to form a professional association to represent its members in negotiations was part of that package, was written into the Act. So the PSA was established in 1913, as I said, and in a few respects it hasn't changed since. It was, and it's vertically structured to cover the entire range of salary scales and occupations. Its membership has always been voluntary. That magazine, the Public Service Journal, and its primary function then and now has been defending its members' wages and conditions. However, what has changed is that right up from its formation until about the end of the World War II, it carried out that function in a very polite, demure, genteel, and ineffective way. It rejected flatly the idea of taking striking action as a last resort when negotiations failed. Strikes for our service are impractical and undesirable, it told its members in 1923. And it even avoided engaging with party politics. In 1925, Labour MPs offered to speak to its branches about their party's policy, and the PSA declined, in case it looked as though they might favour their own party. How did this policy of moderation and goodwill work out for them? Well, very poorly, actually. They didn't get any benefit from it at all, really. The PSA in this early period did have certain things going for it that that you had to admire. Right from the start, it advocated for the radical proposition that its women members should be paid the same as men for doing the same job. This proposal was sneered at by the public and successive governments, and ignored by the Public Service Commissioner. The PSA would politely recommend it year after year, and each year it was ignored. So, from the 1920s, so how do I move on to the next slide? Thank you. The economy began steadily to deteriorate, and successive governments, treated its public servants as the first and most tempting target for cost cutting. Here we see Farmer Bill Massey, Prime Minister, delivering a series of cuts, wage cuts, to the poor pinstripe public servant there. And as the Depression worsened, the PSA joined forces with other state service organisations, for example those representing teachers and railway workers, to try and lobby more effectively in the face of these very, very severe conditions that it faced. But even that did not help them really to restrain the government's policies of belt tightening. One example of those policies, morning and afternoon tea breaks were abolished in 1931. Imagine if they tried to do that now. After the Queen Street riots in, what year was it, John? 32?
32.
Yeah. The government introduced a law that any public servant could be dismissed without notice for, quote, making public statements seeking to bring the government of New Zealand into disrepute. So if you were to criticise the actions of the government at that time in print or in any other public forum, that was grounds for instant dismissal, and indeed some public servants were sacked under that law. So by 1934, when this cartoon appeared in a public service journal, some of those wage cuts were beginning to be restored, especially in the private sector, but the poor old public servant adrift on his raft is having to look at the ship sailing by without any alleviation of his conditions. So, the Labour government, the first Labour government elected the following year, 1935, with an absolute majority and policies that immediately required a much expanded, much better supported, more efficient public service. All sorts of, as we know, social advances that public servants were required to administer. Its manifesto in particular promised to immediately restore cuts to wages and salaries. It repealed that legislation I told you about bringing the government into disrepute. And it allowed public servants to stand for Parliament. This had previously been illegal. Membership of the PSA promptly rose from under 7,000 in the year Labour was elected to over 12,000 2 years later. So they're on a bit of a roll. But many things did not improve markedly for the PSA under the first Labour government. This photograph here shows the Public Service Commissioner on the left, Tom Mark, and the long-serving General Secretary of the PSA on the right, a guy called Frank Miller. He was General Secretary from the formation of the PSA right through till 1944, very long-serving. And as you can see there, that photo, they were the best of mates. They travelled around together on business. They appeared to hang out together on boating holidays, and they were very, very chummy. Labour historian Bert Roth said, however, there was never any doubt as to who was in charge. Mark was a repressive, authoritarian personality, and he ran the public service with a vice-like grip. When World War II broke out, for example, Mark threatened to expel members whose actions and expression of views were disloyal or subversive. So to express disapproval of the government's conscription policies and so on were grounds for dismissal. And certain public servants, such as Noel Kernahan, were indeed dismissed for doing so. So by this time, finally, some younger, stroppier members of the PSA, in particular a guy called Jack Lewin, began to agitate for better representation for new members such as himself. Lewin denounced the old guard of the association. They were mainly drawn from the clerical sector. They were mainly senior officials. They didn't represent the rank and file. Lewin denounced them, I love this, as decorous eunuchs. And that's Lewin there. Looks like a nice, amiable guy. Believe me, you did not want to get on the wrong side of it. There are people here I know who knew Jack Lewin. I never did. And if you have any questions about him, they're better directed to those people. He assembled a Wellington-based group of young activists like himself called the Corridor, whose aim in particular was to get more progressive figures elected to the PSA. I found that the Corridor could still evoke a little frisson of kind of excitement and secretiveness and so on among its former members. Something like, what, 60 years later, people would say, has anyone told you about the Corridor? I was in the Corridor. And it was like you had to lower your voice and look around, has anyone heard you were in it? Because it could get you into serious trouble, you could lose your job, whatever. And people hadn't lost the habit of this sort of excitement that was attached to this organisation. So this was 1944, a member of the Kōrero was elected president, Bert O'Keefe, young guy, on a platform of new blood, new methods, militancy and progressive, persistent action. Frank Miller, who we saw in his rolled up pants back there, was replaced as General Secretary, and a wonderful woman came on to the Executive Council. Standing there in the middle, in the back, in the Kādi, that's Rona Meek, as she was then, I think, a physical education instructor with the Department of Internal Affairs, and one of only 3 women at that time on the Executive Council. She was supported by other very impressive figures such as Kath Eichelbaum, later Kath Kelly, mother of Helen Kelly. And these women said in no uncertain terms at every opportunity that the first country in the world to give women the vote had fallen well behind others in the area of pay equity. For the next 17 years, both national and Labour governments gave lip service to the notion of equal pay and said, oh sure, we're going to introduce it, just not now, all right? And they stalled and stalled. And these women, Rona Meek and others, refused to accept that, really. Rona's husband, Ron Meek, took over editorship as editor of the Public Service Journal, greatly improved it. His successor was a young journalist named Dick Scott, author of groundbreaking works in New Zealand history, such as Ask That Mountain, which I hope many of you have read. And generally speaking, the PSA achieved a great deal of momentum at this time. Jack Lewin made it quite clear that he expected the association to now take a part in key decisions that affected its members, not just to be told what was going to happen to them, but to play a part in making those decisions. Most significantly at that time, drawing up new salary scales, which were in complete disarray and way overdue. And Pete Fraser, the MP, agreed to this with some reluctance. In 1946, Lewin was elected president of the PSA, and in that year, the Public Service Commissioner was finally replaced by a Public Service Commission, several different people, including a PSA representative. So this was a big step, which couldn't have been envisaged earlier, really. Lewin, says Bert Roth, transformed the PSA from a passive, toothless weakling into a powerful instrument of social change. How are we doing for time? Right. These changes did not occur without strong opposition. You will be aware, many of you, of the famous sexual case of 1948, but not all of you maybe. No, okay, shaking heads. In 1948, a young PSA delegate from the National Film Unit named Cecil Holmes went to have a meeting with Lewin, and he left his satchel in his car, unlocked. Big mistake. When he went back to the car, the satchel wasn't there. Or if it was, it had been removed and documents in it copied. These documents proved very politically embarrassing for the PSA. They had been copied and circulated to major public newspapers around the country and to the Prime Minister, who was Walter Nash at the time. The guy behind this covert operation to discredit the PSA was a fellow called Fintan Patrick Walsh, known as the Black Prince, the most powerful figure on the right wing of the Labour movement. He was determined to unseat Lewin, to undermine his role. To some extent it worked, but not altogether, and membership of the PSA continued to rise. By 1950 there were almost 27,000 members, big advance, and they represented about 80% of the total public service workforce. So then they really kicked into gear with the Equal Pay campaign. It became one of the longest and most significant campaigns in the PSA's history. Again, it faced ferocious opposition from, particularly from an employer's rep on the Public Service Commission named George Bock. People who are involved in this campaign talked to me about George Bock in terms of deep contempt. He routinely referred to unmarried female public servants as girls, and he said, why join the public service if you're a male and for the first 4 or 5 years you're going to have a female boss? He said people won't join in that case. It's unbelievable to imagine this today, but that is how people thought at the time. In 1955, another woman joined the PSA Executive Committee. That's her, third from the right, in her trademark red beret, name of Margaret Brand, soon known to all and sundry as Firebrand. She fired motions at every meeting of the committee on equal pay. She was dynamic and unstoppable. There was an equal pay subcommittee formed of the PSA, and one of its active members was a man named Dan Long, who became General Secretary in 1960. And in that year, finally, hallelujah, women reached the top of that mountain on the right, and the Government Service Equal Pay Bill was passed into law. And in that same year, another happy event occurred, and Margaret Brand and Dan Long were married. So, in the 1960s, the PSA was unrecognisable from the one that I described originally. It had clearly abandoned its no strikes policy. Various sections of the membership, psychiatric nurses, airport firefighters, and so on, resorted to measures such as overtime bans, working to rule, go-slows. One of the most successful, colourful, spectacular examples of a lobbying tactic was by school dental nurses in 1974. They wanted to be paid better, like some of their colleagues elsewhere, and they did this by organising a mass march through Wellington. They all flew in from all around the country. All people of my age, not of your age, we remember school dental nurses. They were impressive figures. You didn't want to mess with them. And they wore these white skirts and white stockings and red cardigans. They looked great. And they all arrived in Wellington in uniform. They marched down to Parliament House. A delegated group of them, these guys, went into Parliament and they met the Prime Minister, Norm Kirk, and he agreed on the spot to the pay increase they sought. That's Dan Long standing there, the glasses on the right. Actions like this had a powerful and lasting effect on some of those who took part in them, and they changed the course of their careers as a result. One of the dental nurses on that march was a sweet, shy, retiring young woman from the Waikato named Annette King. The PSA by then was involved in many areas of activity, just winding up here, beyond those that it had started out working for. It had affiliated to the UN, it opposed nuclear weapons tests in the Pacific, in French Polynesia. It had a strong campaign of anti-racism, especially from 1959 when one of its members was refused to drink in a pub in Papakura. His name was Dr. Harry Bennett, and he was the chief medical officer at King Seat Mental Hospital. He happened to be a Maori, and they didn't serve Maoris in that pub. It was discovered that this was one of a wide range of apartheid actions throughout the country, which had been sort of hushed up, which weren't made known, and the PSA was central to uncovering them. In 1976, Dan Long, then General Secretary, was over in Australia on business, and he died suddenly in office, worked himself to death basically. But during his 16 years in that role, he grew the PSA's numbers from 38,000 to 64,000, and it was by then a formidable and impressive body. And I'm going to turn over to Mary Ellen to tell you what it did. Thank you.
Tēnei te mihi kia koutou I runga I te kaupapa o te rā. Great honour to be asked by the Labour History Project to take part in this Rona Bailey lecture about the history of the PSA. And again, great of you all to turn up on what has been a difficult day. A big shout out, especially to those here born after 1980, and an even bigger shout out to those born after 1990, and to even those born after the year 2000. Do we have anyone here born after the year 2000? Thank you. In an era when the unions are under massive pressure, it's great to see you guys being part of a union and even more so turning out to a lecture like this. I'm going to deal with the period from 1975 about to 2008, which was the period of the corporatisation and the privatisation of the public service and the flow-on effects for the PSA and its aftermath. And by 1975, the PSA was the nation's largest union with a membership of 68,000. Membership was more or less compulsory, as well as core public servants. The PSA covered dental nurses, as we saw, meat inspectors, the SIS, staff of the big psychiatric hospitals, and all those who worked in the state-owned enterprises, electricity, forests, the government print office, mining, lands and survey farms. The PSA is an integral part of the benign centralist state, with the notions of collective good, balancing competing interests, and regulating social contracts at its core. That was what the public service was really about. It was a unified career public service based on entry by competitive process, promotion on merit, with security of tenure and pensions on retirement. Politically neutral, it's not affiliated to any party, it was there to give free and frank advice to the government of the day. So the nature of the public service helps us very much to understand the nature of the PSA. Within the PSA there were 130 occupational classes. All employment matters were handled by the State Services Commission, which had a PSA rep sitting on it, right at the centre. Remuneration was fixed by the State Services Conditions of Employment Act 1962. Those who can remember told me that bargaining was rhythmic, it was well choreographed, it was done once a year. Compare that with what goes on today, bargaining. After the annual general wage order for the private sector, the claims committee of the PSA would lodge a claim, and for one occupational class, that group would go up, and then it was carefully choreographed to make sure that they benefited from the order in which the things were settled. That still happens today to a degree. Yeah. So occupational classes within the PSA supported other occupational classes. The unity of the public service was such that meat inspectors would go out in support of dental nurses, okay, as we saw, okay, the dental nurses there. Remember that, we'll come back to it. The PSA and other unions took action over wider political issues, as Marcus mentioned, the war in Vietnam, rugby in South Africa, and with high density, near compulsory membership, huge numbers could be called out on the street. From around the 70s, the economy started to contract, the UK joined the EU, oil prices rose, and consequently industrial action across many sectors was becoming more common. After the national government was elected in 1975, relations between the government and the PSA spiralled downwards. This is Muldoon at the helm. A sinking lid employment policy, so if someone left, they weren't replaced, and contracting out to the private sector was just beginning. The Clyde Dam was being built by the private sector, the first one to be so. The cost of living was rising. In 1982, the wage and price freeze was imposed. This was challenged by the PSA and the CSU, the combined state unions, but to no avail. The PSA, which had traditionally shied away from party politics, now set as a priority the election of a Labour government in 1984. Whoops, is one way to describe it. Whoops. This was followed by high wage settlements at unprecedented levels as the wage and price freeze came off, but the euphoria quickly evaporated as it became obvious that radical reform of the public sector was very high on the government's agenda. There was a general acceptance, even within the PSA, that the public sector did need some streamlining. Administrative processes were very top-down, very bureaucratic, centralised and controlled. With the rise in the cost of living, accountability now became the catch crime. Few realised just how far this notion could be stretched. This was, of course, a neoliberal revolution conducted at lightning speed by a team that were ruthless, committed, and 5 moves ahead of everybody else on the chessboard. Juggernaut podcasts, a very good background to this. The following years were absolutely tumultuous as the benign centralist state was taken to bits, rationalised and corporatised. New public management became the new work order, the main thrust being that private sector ways of working are equally applicable to the public sector. Managerialism, some called it. The blitzkrieg approach of the leading economic ministers, supported by Treasury, coupled with the first past the post electoral system of the time, meant it was all too easy to drive all this stuff through. The principles of collective good, the balancing of competing interests, the regulation of social contracts were very much diluted, almost ignored, while Treasury's role was expanded to enable it to supervise and enforce the new market practices. There is no alternative, was the refrain sung by politicians, business and the media, making it very difficult for the PSA or others to put the case for other options. Enter the State Sector Bill, which revolutionised the workings of the public and state services. It dramatically redesigned state pay fixing, transferred many of the Public Service Commission's employment responsibilities to the new department chief executives, who are now employed on highly paid 5-year contracts closely tied to budget bottom lines. Words like incentivisation and bonuses now entered the public service vocabulary. Each department was to be independent and responsible. It effectively ended the unified nature of the public service, created what we now refer to as silos. The listener described it as legislation by microwave. The PSA went into high campaigning mode against the State Sector Bill. It was a time of unprecedented activity. Demonstrations were held throughout the country, the President Colin Hicks leading from the front. The campaign against this bill represents basically the high watermark in combined public and state sector street protests throughout the country. Thousands, tens of thousands in some cases, were pulled out to protest this bill. It was a revolution, really. They knew that. Okay. The man was Stan Roger, an ex-PSA president, was now Minister of Labour and State Services, and he was driving the reform process through. To give him his due, he did set up a consultative committee with the state unions, but they walked away from the process believing it was a sham. Some would say the PSA did not engage enough with the reform process. That school of thought emphasises engagement and influence over opposition. But the world was changing radically. The size and impact of the changes were very hard to anticipate. There was a strong sense of the past, but little ability to anticipate the future. Stan Roger introduced the bill to Parliament on the 10th of December 87, just before Christmas, when MPs are always keen to get away. The joke being that he referred to it as minor technical amendments. This could be an urban myth, I'm not sure. After the Act was passed, the PSA dramatically and publicly stripped Stan Roger of his life membership. Workplaces were now subjected to intense scrutiny, often resulting in restructuring and redundancies. For the PSA, it was a time of intense work to try and consolidate occupational conditions, wanting to hold what they had in the face of the devolution that was coming. Things like all the departments got split up. Some people here will remember the Department of Lands and Survey. Part of it went to the new Department of Conservation. The Forest Service went mainly to the SOE Forest Corp. The land and development work went to the SOE Land Corp, which left just a technical admin department, which was known as DOSLI, which is now known as LINS. So these were just the kind of massive changes that took, and it continued to happen as well. Relationships, loyalties, understandings established through time and shared experience, all the intangibles of the old system went out the window. Many CEs were recruited from the private sector. According to managerial philosophy, you didn't need specialist experience of the area to manage it. If you can manage MSD, you can manage corrections and primary industries. Zigzagging between public and private sectors became common. The Public Finance Act 1989 enshrined the new public management principles of operation: transparency, accountability, and responsible fiscal management. This guided the CEs and their departmental staff. The other gargantuan act which intersects with this was the State-Owned Enterprises Act, which corporatised all the state-owned enterprises. Under the terms of this act, all public or government trading operations were now to operate as market-driven entities. On the 1st of April 1987, 5,000 PSA members became unemployed as several of these new corporate entities came into being, with stripped-down workforces and a new-look profit motive at the core. Forest Corp, Land Corp, Electric Corp, you can remember them all. Post offices and forestry camps were closed, power stations were increasingly automated, electricity, gas, this is done to all energy groups. The jobs gone were often full-time jobs remunerated under the State Services Conditions of Employment Act, and these jobs were often attached to housing. The full impact of this act on Māori, who often lost full-time breadwinner's job along with their house, has yet to be fully examined. The loss of PSA membership, of course, was dramatic. Once corporatised, these state-owned assets were easy to sell, often at bargain basement prices. What was told and sold to the public as necessary for boosting the government coffers was in fact a lot of cheap insider trading to mates of the government. Faye Richwhite facilitated the process, Fox and the Henhouse arrangement. Those sold included New Zealand Steel, Petrocorp, the Development Finance Corporation, the Rural Bank, the National Film Unit, State Forests, the Government Printing Office, sold to Graham Hart for a song, and Telecom. Privatisation of state assets proceeded apace, eroding a significant resource base for the government and transferring many members out of the PSA into the private sector. Membership was massively impacted. At this point, it was not constitutionally possible for the PSA to follow members into the private sector. As we know, the radical economic changes were being accompanied by gains in the social sphere, and these were reflected in the PSA itself. Koro Wetere, Minister for Māori Affairs, initiated the Hui Taumata, the meeting of all Māori unionists, and by the end of '87, Ngā Toa Awhina Runanga was born, the ancestor of the current PSA Runanga. There were 15 throughout New Zealand. These sat alongside the PSA geographical branches and had the same voting powers. The PSA leadership responded well, and slowly ways of getting treaty processes up within the union were worked out. Moana Jackson played a very key role in this. During the same period, there was a government-led push to get women into the public service. Marvellous. A Ministry of Women's Affairs was set up. EEO, Equal Employment Officers, were appointed, and positive discrimination procedures implemented. PSA women's conferences were well attended. Great relationships formed. Many of these people have been inspired by the women's conferences of the 70s, led by Sonia Davies, Miriam Dell, and so on. Sue Piper was elected, she happened to be the only woman in the PSA executive in the early 80s, had been many women beforehand, but she was the only one. And then she later became treasurer, and in '88 she succeeded Colin Hicks as the first woman president, being re-elected in 1990. This same government that corporatised and privatised even set up the Trade Union Education Authority, TURIO, in 1986. Its role was to oversee and coordinate trade union education. So PSA was quick to take advantage of this. But despite all the positive social gains, by the end of the 80s, relationships with the government were at an all-time low. The CTU had been formed in '87 from the blue-collar FOL and the CSU state unions in the face of the neoliberal push, which had relegated the state unions to the outer margins of influence. National was elected in 1990. Thought things couldn't get worse, but they could. Labour lost 27 of its 56 seats. Its share of the vote was the lowest since 1931. National tackled the unions head on. The Employment Contracts Act destroyed national awards, introduced individual contracts, made union membership optional, allowed a choice of bargaining agent, and brought enterprise bargaining to all sectors. What in fact to be done to the state unions is now being done to all unions. Unsurprisingly, they repealed the 2-year legislation. The PSA had to remodel itself radically to cope with reduced membership and a greatly enlarged workload. Enterprise bargaining was now in full swing, bringing bosses and employees right up against each other. With all the old pay-fixing apparatus and supports gone, delegates suddenly found themselves involved with almost no training, often facing people at the table from the ministry or treasury to make sure everyone was towing the party line. Power moved from PSA elected officials to staff on the ground as decision-making was devolved. It's hard now to appreciate just what a massive change this was, what a fundamental and disruptive change it was. Nothing was gained, it was a time of terrible loss. Deprofessionalisation and demoralisation went hand in hand with this new work order. Now, very glad that Mark put up this picture of the dental nurses, because I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. Some here will remember when dental clinics were attached to a centrally located school and all children in the surrounding area would be bused to the clinic. No parental consent required, no idiosyncrasies taken into account, but all got their teeth checked and fixed by well-trained and properly paid professionals. Once the health reforms of the 90s got underway under businessman Ron Trotter, the school dental service was an immediate target because they were all separate workplaces, and women of course. So different terms and conditions were negotiated with all the different chiefs, the Crown Health Enterprises, headed up by managers rather than health professionals. Very few dental nurses were able to maintain their previous conditions. I'm just quoting from a dental nurse at the time. Different practices evolved. The tooth-filling materials you used depended on the budget in your area. If you developed something new, you weren't able to share it with your colleagues in other places because we had to sell it to them. The service was stripped down. It was the young ones who had to go because they were cheaper to pay out. We lost those in their 20s, those with their whole career in front of them, a generation of dental nurses. No one was entering the service, the training schools were closed, we'd lost our relativity with the public health nurses. It was as though nobody valued our work or cared about us. By the late 90s, the school dental service as we knew it had changed completely. Most school clinics were moved into community centres, the onus going on to parents to get the children there. Voluntary unionism had arrived, many workers simply didn't join up. Those who did could choose who to sign up with. This led to an unsettled period of walkouts, poaching and the establishment of alternative unions, New Pay, Tax Pro and CANS, being those best known to the PSA. The most positive event for the PSA during this period was the amalgamation with the Northern and Central local government unions. With many going on to individual contracts, the PSA experimented with a legal advisory service to help members deal with these individual contracts. During the 90s, the PSA became more of a service model, making itself an attractive choice, emphasising travel and lifestyle benefits of joining up, becoming more compliant with the ethos of the time. Engagement with wider political issues basically didn't happen anymore. There was so much work to do just to stay afloat. But the big debate hanging over from the 80s, whether to be oppositional or to engage and influence, now became urgent. Major restructurings were occurring in the departments of social welfare, the health system, education, agriculture. By 1993, PSA membership had dipped to around 50,000. It was losing out badly. The question became how best to hold membership and look after the interests of members in what was an increasingly hostile situation. More strategy was required. Old street fighting tactics didn't work. With voluntary unionism, vastly reduced numbers and the rigidity of the ECA legislation, the union organisers led a change. So here we come up to the notion of, partnership. Collaboration, some call it. Collaboration with the boss had been viewed as a sin. What was now being said was that collaboration is not a sin, it's the only way to go, but it must be collaboration for the purposes of influence and engagement. Part of the argument was that the PSA had had a good reputation in the past across public services. It needed to get back that recognition among senior managers and politicians. It needed to emphasise the quality of public services, and so emerged the concept of partnership for quality. Partnership for Quality roadshows were held to sell the new pragmatism to members. The President of CTU, Ken Douglas, he picked up the Partnership for Quality message and he amplified it. So in this frame, the PSA became more of a political lobbyist rather than an adversary of the government. Those who supported the Partnership for Quality would say, how cold do you want to get? Why not come into the tent and try it? Those who were opposed would say partnership is what the shark said to the minnow. And certainly the PSA was coming at partnership from a very weakened position. The ruling national government were never persuaded to sign up to it. As the 90s went on, the issue of partnership or opposition created a dysfunctional standoff between the elected officials and the staff in the PSA. It's a very big division, increasingly ugly. The PSA Journal, which Mark spoke about, were a very remarkable publication really, did not support partnership, and in 1998 the editor was ejected bodily from the building. The president in 1998, Narai Hania, he was opposed to partnership. The pro-partnership lobby, however, were more and more in charge. They needed a sympathetic executive. They ran a ticket for change in 1999. This group was elected. Major constitutional changes were unfurled and a new three-person secretariat, sympathetic to PFQ, Partnership for Quality, was inaugurated. So 99, big year in terms of change. So this was how the PSA entered the 21st century. In response to the public sector restructure, the PSA itself had to restructure. Corporatisation and privatisation meant new devolved structures and quicker, more responsive operating modes. Membership was now divided into industrial sectors. Core public services, community public services, district health boards, local government and the state sector, things like the CRIs and the Reserve Bank. Sector governance replaced regional branches and the Runanga. Runanga reps were appointed to the different sectors, but Māori energy was now dispersed across the sector governance structures. Sector governance created sector loyalties, people now identified with their own group or workplace rather than the public sector as a whole. Very understandable. Computerisation, which I haven't even mentioned really, had run alongside, parallel to all of these political developments, and was of course the perfect tool for the more devolved technocratic modus operandi. By 2000, membership was down to 37,000. The PSA welcomed the election of the Labour Alliance government with a commitment to some rebuilding of the public sector, and it was in this context that Partnership for Quality was officially signed up with the new government. The PSA wanted the State Sector Act repealed, being very much aware that the independent chief executives were the barrier preventing consistent conditions and pay across the whole public service. However, the government did not actually want to repeal the State Sector Act. It was not prepared to alter the basics of the new public management model. Stuck with them. It may have been that thrifty Michael Cullen did not want to repeal the Public Finance Act. Not exactly sure, but that may have been the case. And after 15 years, the public service was populated by those who had known no other way. The new model had become the wallpaper, invisible. It was hard for most to think about an alternative. The Employment Relations Act that the new Labour Alliance government brought through emphasised relationships, good faith bargaining, the 30-day rule, collective agreements and MECAs. So some changes were legislated in. So that took a lot of the edge off the Employment Contracts Act. But the fact was the Partnership for Quality failed to put tangible changes in place for members. If the CE happened to be sympathetic, great, but increasingly they weren't. The Tripartite Forum, a regular meeting of the PSA, the State Services Commission and reps of the CEs, achieved very little. Should the PSA have pushed harder during these years of Labour? Some people think they should have. The social agenda was positive up to a point again. Lynn Middleton, one of the new Secretariat, worked very hard with the Minister of Labour, Margaret Wilson, to get a pay equity unit set up within the Department of Labour. They established tools and mechanisms for workplaces to examine all the factors underpinning pay and employment inequities for women. However, none of the initiatives were mandatory. There was simply an expectation by government that employers and unions would work together to achieve satisfactory outcomes under the rosy-tinted umbrella of the Partnership for Quality. Well, guess what? Now, just a little side story. In 1998, meat inspection was corporatised. It was taken out of the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, divided into two state-owned enterprises and relabelled MAF Quality Management in preparation for sale. The meat inspectors put up a great fight, walking out of meetings, getting the first plane home, not talking to you, or whatever it is. And then, the end of 99, the Labour Alliance government was elected. This gave them a bit of a breathing space. Keith Gutzel, whose name is synonymous with the meat inspectors to this day, phoned the Minister of the Food Safety Authority in the new Labour government to talk about this issue. The Minister of the Food Safety Authority was now Annette King, ex-dental nurse. When Keith rang, she said, "I remember you meat inspectors, you came out for us in 1974. And that was the end of the privatisation of meat inspection. Until now, of course, they're at it again. And Keith Gutzel was there on the steps of Parliament the other day, still protesting, so good on him. Stan Roger, that ex-president of the PSA who had driven through the State Sector Act, was reinstated as a life member of the PSA in 2004. Time had passed. Labour hadn't repealed the State Sector Act. They had acquiesced to Stan's plans, and with the Partnership for Quality in place, Stan had become simply the architect of what was now widely accepted, rather than the traitor he had been in 1987. Membership of the PSA had changed markedly by the new century. Voluntary unionism and alternative unions accounted for some losses. The full-time male breadwinner membership had been decimated by the corporatisation of state-owned enterprises, while the State Sector Act had taken many in senior roles out of the association. The big psychiatric hospitals had been closed, another tranche of membership gone. But there were gains as the allied health sector within the hospitals, the physios, the radiographers, the dietitians and so on, came under PSA coverage. Numbers of female clerical and admin staff had increased following the early collapse of the Clerical Workers Union. And the Labour government were restaffing the public sector. As more and more social service delivery was devolved to the community and private sector, the PSA expanded its membership into these areas as well. Pacifica and Asian workers increased as a proportion of PSA membership. So membership had definitely broadened by about 2008, and it was on the increase. The coverage included many of the new lowly paid. But there was quite a way to go to bring Māori, women and ethnic minorities through to the front ranks of both government and the PSA. Bargaining across multiple sectors and collectives and personal grievances took a lot of time and energy away from a wider political focus. And reflecting political and social change, union membership had become more conservative and service focused. Enter the key government. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Fleur.
Thanks, Muriel, and mahi mai moha, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And it's lovely to hear Lynn Middleton's name mentioned actually, because my entry to the PSA came through Lynn and Margaret Wilson, because my flatmate and I got a job being cleaners for them both as students, and it was an incredible job, and it opened up the PSA to me, but also, it won't surprise anyone in this audience, they paid really well. We couldn't believe our luck. We got this cleaning job with, I think it was like $25 an hour then. Like, it was good money. Anyway, I just want to start by acknowledging Sibel and the Labour History Project and Mark and Muriel, and thank you so much. And it is quite tricky to reflect on a time that you've lived through, and I think it's quite hard in many ways to really draw strands of common experience or of historical analysis from that time, but I'll give it a go. And I sort of thought what might be quite helpful to do is to give you some kind of an insight into some of the operational side of the PSA and how during the period since the election of the key government really, we've responded to the political environment operationally, because elements of it I think are also part of the social history of New Zealand. So we do, I think, as a union, reflect what's happening in Aotearoa, as well as really being part of that. So I guess just to say as well that I will at the end talk a little bit about the political context we're facing at the moment, because I think it's very important that we make the right calls and that we take into account the history of the PSA. And I guess my message to this audience, and I'll come to it at the end, is that we would really like your help and support and advice in doing that. We don't have all the answers, but the stakes feel very high. In terms of the period from 2008 until today, it's a time when I've worked mainly for that period at the PSA in a variety of roles. And I think one of the most interesting concepts that I've really started to understand is the role that technology's played in organising. So at the beginning in 2008, we were still stuffing envelopes, and we were union officials' children. We were always being brought in and being paid, actually not like Lynn Middleton and Mark Nicholson, quite low rates to stuff envelopes to make sure that we were out in the workplaces and that we were recruiting and that we were getting campaign messages across. Social media, of course, now plays such a big role in both our internal communication with members, but also our external communication, which was obviously not part of it then. What we saw, though, was the key English government being elected, and many of the same things that we see from this national government, we saw from that government. But I would say to you, it was a lot less harsh, and the relationship was a lot easier to manage. So in 2008, John Key came to the PSA Congress, and he asked to come and speak at the Congress, and he was welcomed, and it was a difficult speech he delivered, but it was at the Brentwood Hotel in Kilburnie, and in that speech he announced the end of the Public Service Tripartite Forum that had given us a seat at the table, us a point of engagement with CEs collectively, and was quite important to the PSA. That government also got rid of pay equity, and one of the first things they did was cancel and gut the Department of Labour's Pay and Employment Equity Unit. In fact, on the day it was gutted, it became clear to the public servants working there that they were going to throw out all the materials. So a bunch of trolleys went over from the PSA and grabbed all the files and try and keep them, because otherwise they were going to be thrown out. And also at that time, the then Chief Executive of the Department of Labour tried to ban those workers from going on a quick picket that we put in place to oppose its closing, which I think is an interesting thing to pick up on what you were saying, Mark, in terms of the evolving nature of public servants' fundamental human rights. And we see constant attacks on that, and it's been something that actually both governments of both colours, have been challenged by and that we've had to stand up against. We got what I think was a quite groundbreaking opinion from Tony Ellis, which outlined just how fundamental these human rights are for public servants and how so easily they are taken away simply by an email, in that instance from the Chief Executive of the Department of Labour. And we saw it during the Clark government as well, with the Seabed and Foreshore public servant Chief Executives were very conservative in their advice to public servants in that time as well. Again, during that National Party time, we saw those same policies of privatisation, including of prisons, which failed, of energy companies. It was a very difficult time for our members. We, however, did grow during that period, and that has been our experience under this national government as well. We saw the very important naming of the PSA being given a te reo name, Te Pukengi Hiri Tikanga Mahi, by our kaumātua at the time, the late Kiwhare Mihaka. And that was a very important event and occasion and time when that name was gifted to the PSA, and it's a really treasured part of the PSA now, and forms is always in our official communication and an important part of our induction for staff and delegates. Under that national government, we decided to create formal strategic goals for the union, so trying to move the everyday into some kind of strategy of opposition to the government, but also to try and seek a proactive agenda for members, not to just be defined by the political circumstances that we were facing, but to try and lift members' aspiration and try and define for ourselves where we wanted workplaces to go. The strategic goals at the time were transforming our workplaces, eliminating pay gaps, and creating public support for community and public services. And I reflect on that one a lot because I think when we are looking at what this government has done, we really have got a long way to go before the community value public services in the way that we know they need to, given their importance. And I think if you look at the last general election, really you saw the National Party politically benefit from beating up on public servants and beating up on public services. So that is a constant challenge for us to work out ways to show the value of the work that our members do, and we often look to celebrate the work of public servants, and everyone always says, "I'll do a customs officer or do a dock hut worker," but actually it's much more complicated than that, and I'm not even convinced that those examples really send enough of a message of strength about the value of public services. We saw as I say, a steady growth in our membership. We went from around 40,000 in the early 2000s to 54,000 in 2008, and I just checked our membership figures before I came here this evening, and it's over 97,000. So we've grown significantly even under this government, and we're recently having a big surge on particular groups of members. We were particularly ambitious for women, and I think, and I'll come on to that in terms of pay equity, but I did want to reflect on the relatively industrially harmonious time of the key government. And one of the things I liked to say about Simeon Brown during the health dispute was that previous national governments have shown themselves to be quite adept at settling industrial disputes. And they actually were. That national government was quite active in its work with unions. If there was a hint of a strike, we usually got a meeting with the Cabinet Minister. If you look at what they did in the health sector, they set up what was called at the time the National Terms of Settlement, which was basically a sector-wide agreement with all health workers in different unions, and really delivered an across-the-board pay increase the first year, and the first time it was done, and the next time it was done was a bit more fragmented, but did deliver professional gains as well as increases in pay. And I think that government was much more active, and obviously the economy was in a different place, but they did just seem to feel more responsibility for settling industrial disputes than the current lot do. In terms of the PSA internally, we during this time formalised what we call networks, and that's really groups separate to our governance structure that represent particular interests, the demographic or sector groupings, things like the Outlet PSA network, the Young Members Network, the Pacifica Network, and we've got some other ones that have been created in recent years. And really what they've tried to do is create different ways for people to get involved in the union. So if it wasn't a traditional workplace representative structure that suited you, we've got an Asian, Latin American and African members network, for example, and we are seeing people come involved in those networks and then go on to be active in the workplaces or to go on to help organise other workers in those areas. And I think Mary Ellen commented on this, but we have seen the national structure of Te Ruranga o Ngāta Awhina, our Māori members network, and we have really seen the bicultural nature of Māori membership more reflected in the way that the board operates. Our executive board has a tuakana on it. The Runganga is much more active in workplaces. We have specific identified Māori delegates operating in workplaces. And so there really has been led a lot by Ki Whare Mihaka at the time, a real resurgence of the involvement of Māori within the union and a proper representative space for them in our governance structures. 2010 obviously brought significant challenges. During that time we saw the Christchurch earthquakes, and obviously that had a massive impact in 2011 on our members in Christchurch, but also sort of started, if we reflect, the beginning of this concept of working from home, or public servants being able to operate in their homes, which obviously is still something we're battling. We also saw the government attacks on health and safety, Pike River, and of course it's remiss not to mention Helen Kelly's role in demanding accountability for what happened at Pike River. And the PSA was fundamentally really deeply involved in that, including because we had members who had done work inspecting those mines. And it was very difficult for them, and it was very difficult for the union movement, obviously, given the massive tragedy that had occurred. And we really supported and were active in the CTU's work in that area. We also created an organising response in terms of a network of health and safety representatives. We then continued to develop in different sectors. We followed our members into from the district health board models into contracted community services, both through the precursors to Oranga Tamariki, but also through the health sector and local government. We merged with the Southern Local Government Officers Union and became the nationwide local government union. And in 2013, the PSA celebrated its centenary, and that was really a great opportunity to reflect on the contribution of the union, but also something that we deliberately did during that time was have celebrations throughout the country. So it really reflected the regional organising model that had existed before, and tried to really acknowledge the work that people throughout time had done for the PSA in those regions. And yes, Keith Gutzel played a critical role in the far south celebrations, but also many others. The other thing that I think is worthy of noting is the reflection of ngā kaupapa principles within collective agreements. And we really saw the commitment to upholding the needs and interests and aspirations of Māori workers within our collective agreements. And you saw that with the ngā kaupapa strategic agenda, and we saw that in things like the Ministry of Education collective agreement, which was recently challenged successfully, the employer's behaviour was challenged successfully, where it sought to introduce the concepts of kaitiakitanga and tika and pono into employment relationships. And really what we saw is employers being held to a different standard, and a te tiriti informed standard when it came to dismissing workers. We've also, the media has become quite interested this week in the Oranga Tamariki cultural leave provisions, which they say were agreed under a national government. They were renegotiated, Labour government, they were also renegotiated under a national government last year. But they provided for a recognition of the cultural needs of Māori to take time off and to contribute to the iwi, or contribute in a whole range of ways. In fact, it's a very flexible enabling clause. We also had the introduction of Rule 5 in our PSA rules, which has made a huge difference to how the union operates on a day-to-day basis. That rule requires that any formal representative grouping or delegation of the PSA must represent the gender makeup of the members. So if you are a health sector delegation, we're highly unionised in health, and the vast majority of our members are women. Delegations in health, delegations to conferences, delegations to in terms of bargaining, do need to reflect that gender makeup. And that really has meant that we have to actively seek and promote women delegates to be actively involved in the union. And it's had a very culturally positive impact, and obviously has improved the legitimacy of those representations and delegations. The closing years of the key English administration also were happening at the same time, obviously, as the Christine Bartlett case. I just want to acknowledge Alistair's leading role in that, alongside Peter Cranny. And although that was led by the Service and Food Workers Union, the settlement applied to many thousand PSA women workers in care and support, and had a huge impact, a life-changing impact on those women. And we at the same time took a case against the State Services Commission advancing gender pay principles for mixed work. So that was a female-dominated claim for Christine Bartlett and women in those industries, and there were many other female-dominated industries that could advance that. We at the same time took a case to the Employment Court seeking principles for mixed work, so all of the barriers that women face when it's not female-dominated areas, and got a settlement of that case that involved agreed gender pay principles and agreed provisions like flexible by default. And in fact, just this week we were in a call with the Employment Relations Authority when the MB are trying to repeal elements of that exist in their collective agreement by forcing through policies that are inconsistent with it. In terms of the election of the Jacinda Ardern government, it was a revolution in terms of our access to the beehive, our ability to affect change, but also the types of approaches to widespread structural change that we saw. For example, within Three Waters, unions were actively involved, supported by the state, to participate in the change, and we saw that with the Public Service Act as well. We were able to get a clear commitment in that Act to enshrining the Bill of Rights and upholding the rights of public servants to be politically active, and then there's now a specific section in that Act that enables it. Even though Crown Law said it was unnecessary and it was dangerous to reiterate other acts, we were able to advance these arguments and get that, because it has still been quite a significant issue for us to have the rights of public servants to be politically active in the same way every other person in New Zealand can be. Obviously COVID had a major impact on our operation as a union, like it did every other organisation in New Zealand, and we were strong advocates for PPE for particularly care workers. They were left behind originally within COVID. These are people who go into people's homes every day. They didn't have the personal protective equipment they needed. We saw public servants being forced to work from home in some situations where it wasn't appropriate or possible, and obviously those things were challenging in terms of our advocacy. Since the, and what we saw during that Labour government, the ability to make advancements on issues like pay equity for admin clerical workers, life-changing pay equity settlements for social workers, and fairly harmonious collective bargaining arrangements. There were a few strikes, but they were usually settled pretty quickly. And again, much like the key government, we had pretty quick access to cabinet ministers to quietly intervene if need be. I think just want to reflect in closing really on what we've seen under this current government, because, and I guess I'm interested in this audience view about whether it is worse than other governments. It feels to me like it is, but I haven't lived as much through those other governments. But really what we saw in the first round of cuts was just this harsh 6 or 7.5% cut based on the growth that you'd had in the public service department the year before. And chief executives and HR departments were just scrambling to find money. And there was no proper public policy analysis of the impact of those cuts. And really, we made a strategic call not to release change documents because we were given them, because we were the union, we were given them sometimes because of provisions under collective agreements, but also they sometimes included quite unhelpful language about our members and their jobs that we didn't really think would be usefully in the public domain. But what we did make a call to do is to expose and highlight what was in them and put our own narrative on that, including wading through and trying to work out how many jobs were going, work out where they were going from and what the impact would be. And I guess my reflection is that it's pretty easy for governments to come in and dismiss public servants, despite all the rhetoric about how hard it is to sack people. It really was quite easy, and they really didn't need to do any assessment of utility implications, health and safety implications, consistency with royal commissions, consistency with other legislation. We saw cuts that were being made that then departments go, well, hang on a minute, that means we can't comply with this. We better put those people back in. And chief executives have admitted that to us privately. So I guess I'm interested in your reflections on this government in the context of PSA history. But under this government, we've obviously seen a major betrayal when it comes to pay equity. We didn't imagine that they would reach into the Employment Relations Authority and cancel claims. We didn't imagine that they would take money out of the budget in what we have, I think, rightly and fairly called wage theft. $12.8 billion that was signalled to be in the pockets of women and their families, taken by the government. We've also seen, as Mary Ellen said, the upcoming privatisation of meat inspection, and that, despite the fact that it puts our export markets at risk, this government seems just hell-bent on privatisation for no other reason but ideology. It's very hard to grasp why they're doing these things. It doesn't even seem to be the ACT party that's pushing it. We've obviously also seen really strong work with other unions. I want to acknowledge Grant and the mega strike, I think, was a historical turning point. It was unions working together, but it was also hundreds of thousands of workers standing up against this government's double standard when it comes to cost of living. And I guess I just wanted to close really with what's going to happen in Parliament tomorrow, which is major changes to the Employment Relations Act that overwrite the law, that enable all workers to be turned into contractors because it's written down that they're contractors, that mean that personal grievance remedies are gutted. And Peter Cranny described it to me actually as the total collapse of workers' rights from a very low base. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. It is a version of fire at will. It is an attack on personal grievance remedies and the existence of personal grievances that we've had for 50 years. We have a situation where if you've been unjustifiably dismissed, this law bans the authority from giving you a meaningful remedy. And so what we're going to see is obviously employers taking full advantage of it, I expect, including public sector employers, and massive disparity that already existed getting even worse. So just in closing, I feel enormous pressure to uphold the history of the PSA, but also to represent those workers who have been dismissed from the public service, who had more to give and whose work is very important. And we really as a union now just need to keep prosecuting the case of the impact of those cuts, and that's what we're trying to do by taking a pretty direct approach to it, but it's quite hard, and sometimes the media don't care that much, and sometimes it feels like the dock worker or the customs officer or the kind of concept of frontline and back office is sort of working. So I guess I'm quite interested in, we're very motivated by the fight, we're very up for it, we're quite energised by it, but I guess I know there's meant to be questions, but I would also be really interested and grateful if there are any comments and reflections from you all, because this is a very experienced audience, and we genuinely need all the help we can get. Thanks.
Please, Mary Ellen.
The panel have very kindly agreed to let me have the last word, so thank you very much. And I'd like to just really salute Fleur over there, who is doing the most marvellous job front-footing so many of these attacks on the public service and the PSA, and you really are making, you're doing a very good job in very hard circumstances. So I feel she needs just to have that acknowledged. I think we all accept the Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of our nation, and should be absolutely untouchable. It's not untouchable because this government. But it seems to me that the second untouchable for this country should be public services. Public services built this country, really, the infrastructure from the time of Vogel through the Liberal government of the 90s, the first Labour government of 35, and many subsequent governments, both Labour and National, built the public services. So did our great-grandfathers, our grandmothers, our aunts, our uncles, ourselves. Sometimes literally built the houses, built the hospitals, planted the forests, founded and expanded government departments, all with taxpayers' money, our money. We own them. This is a very different history from the UK, the US, and even Australia. Furthermore, it is in a small country like ours, without old universities, without old established churches or huge philanthropic foundations, the public service was the institution that attracted the intellectuals of the day. So people know a few of these, people like Clarence Beebe in education, Owen Woodhouse, who designed ACC, architects like Klushka, and so on. And I mean, people like Rona Bailey, people like Jack Lewin, Rhea McBride of the Public Service Commission. All these people saw the public sector as a vocation and tried to translate their vision into a reality for the New Zealand population. Our public services were a proud New Zealand creation. We owned them. They should never have been corporatised, privatised, sold off to the highest bidder, in some cases the lowest bidder, by those who saw them only as a profitable enterprise. I know I'm talking to the converted here, but it seems like the converted are simply the only people who can talk to these days. But we must hold on to what we've got. We need to make the case that public services belong to the public. We pay for them, they are there to serve us, not to profit some already wealthy corporation or individual at our expense. Believe it or not, this government has chosen to hold the election on November the 8th, Public Services Day. Let us remind them of this, but also let them know that for us every day is Public Services Day. We must fight this election on the value of public services. Yes? Do we have an organisation that could lead this fight? Do we?
Yes.
What's it called? PSA. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone, and thank you for this.
I just want to thank our speakers very much. I'm Mary, I'm the co-chair of Labour History Project. I want to thank you so much. And I also want to thank Sibel, who had the idea of asking the three speakers to speak in this way. It was a brilliant idea. You all spoke so well. It was so informative, and tracing the arc of that history was really important. Each person built on it so very, very well. So thank you all very much. And we have a very small gift for everyone here. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Fleur.